दिखने में तिब्बती है मगर दिमाग और हालचाल में सब भारतीय ही है. So many issues came up during this conference. I'm very grateful to the religious personages who are represented here. And Professor Anand Kumarji, we have known for more than 2-3 decades. We have worked together on many occasions. And Indreshji, now more than, I remember when he started Himalaya Parivar in 2002 in Varmaji's place. That was perhaps one of our first meetings, but since then he has been very, very actively associated with the cause of Tibet in moving it forward, to getting people together. And as he said today, Bharat Divas Sayuk Manch kabhi bacche bhi paida ho gaya. So there are many other organizations that have sprung up in the years. And in the last few years, I have not been very actively involved with the Indian Tibet support groups. So I find that now there are many other new organizations that have come up over the last few years. And Krimiji has always been there, like Surendra Kumarji is, we were not childhood friends, but we seem like childhood friends, having worked in Delhi for a long time. And then Sujit Kumarji, I met him last year for the first time in Italy at the International Parliamentarians Alliance on China conference, where Sujitji represented the Indian Parliament in this group of parliamentarians who take up action against China. So it's a great honor personally for me, and also on behalf of the Central Tibetan Administration, to be having this physical meeting after many years. Since Surendraji said that I came 8-9 hours by car yesterday, and immediately after this I have to go back to Dharamsala again, another 9 hours. So maybe I should speak for another 3 hours. Now we are at least 45 minutes beyond schedule, but since having traveled for 18 hours, at least I should spend a little time to report to you as Tibet supporters as to how we think, how the Central Tibetan Administration perceives the Tibet situation, and how we are trying to work towards resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict. आजकल हम लोग तिब्बत इशू भी नहीं बोलते हैं, इसको Sino-Tibet conflict, इसका status भी शब्दों में भी इसको we have to give that significance to the whole conflict. So maybe first I'll touch on the history part, which I think Sujitji also touched on, talking about Michael van Walt van Praag's book, Tibet Brief 2020. And also I want to mention the fact that there is another book by a Chinese professor called Professor Lau Han Tin, who is now in United States, retired in San Diego. So these two books, written one by a Chinese professor and another by a Western professor, and their approaches towards the research on Tibet history is totally different. That is why, and also the fact that it's not like Tibetans have not written history about Tibet. It has been there since Shagapa's time in the 60s. And there have been many more books on the historical status of Tibet. But unfortunately, Tibetan version of Tibetan history would be construed propaganda. And unfortunately also over the last many decades, China's propaganda has been so strong and pervasive that almost every country in the world and every people in the world believe that Tibet must have been part of China since time immemorial, or since antiquity, as Chinese government says. When we talk about Michael's book, Tibet 2020, this book was published about 2 years ago. And 8 years before that, within 8 years, Michael met with 70, 80 scholars, not just from China, but from many countries in Inner Asia. And he came to the conclusion that whether it is the Tibet-Mongol relationship, which was earlier than Mongol-China relationship. For the Chinese, the period of Yuan is only between that period when the Mongols ruled China. But the Yuans are Mongols. They existed even before the Yuan and after the Yuan. And that was one dynasty of the Tibetans, the Sakya dynasty in 13th and 14th century. Then China was occupied but taken over by the Ming, who are the real Chinese, because the Mongolians are not Chinese. The Ming ruled China from 1368 to 1644. And we had 3 dynasties between that. We had the Pamodruba dynasty, we had the Rinpong dynasty, we had the Debatsangpa dynasty for almost 300 years. Then Chinese came under the rule of the Manchus. If you had watched Kung Fu movies, you will see that in these Kung Fu movies, Chinese are always the protagonists, and the Manchus are always the antagonists. That is because the societal perspective of the Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. So from 1644 to 1911, even there, the 5th Dalai Lama had taken over the temporal and spiritual leadership of the Tibetans in 1642, 2 years before the Mings took over China. And the Mings are real Chinese, but we didn't have much relation with the Mings between that period. From 1368 to 1644. From 1644 to 1911 was the period when the Manchus took over China, and the Manchus are not Chinese. So Michael proves that whether it's Tibet's relationship with Mongols, or Tibet's relationship with the Mings, or Tibet's relationship with the Qing, if Qing and Yuan can be considered as Chinese dynasties, and as per international law today, Tibet has never been considered part of China. And what Professor Lau, the Chinese professor, did was to study only the imperial Chinese historical records. He didn't refer to any other documents. And imperial Chinese records, whether it is the Yuan or the Ming or the Qings, they have never ever considered Tibet as part of China. And these 2 books have come out in the last 2 years, and the Chinese government has not been able to come up with any response to these 2 historical narratives. Now, unfortunately, as I said before, much of the Western world depend on Chinese documents for Asian history, which happens to be distorted. Now, that is why the present cabinet of the Central Tibetan Administration, even though we continue to persist with the middle way approach, where the official position of His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been, and whenever we talk about negotiation, Chinese government put these preconditions on His Holiness, saying that His Holiness should say that Taiwan is part of Tibet, or His Holiness should say that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. And His Holiness is a Buddhist monk. He cannot lie on history. That is why His Holiness came up with this very wise answer, saying that I am not a historian. Let us leave history to historians. What is more important is the future of the Tibetan people. So that is why he adopted the middle way approach, considering the reality of the situation inside Tibet. So when we first came into exile, His Holiness keeps repeating this statement or this story. Then when His Holiness moved or was staying in Missouri, he had this first international conference, press conference. And so when somebody asked about the government of Tibet, then His Holiness said, wherever me and my kashak is, is where the Tibetan government is. A few days after that, the Indian government sent an emissary saying that we do not recognize Tibetan government in exile. And since that, His Holiness never tried with any of the successive Indian governments to seek recognition of the Tibetan government in exile, unless that comes from the Indian government. If Indian government decides to accept Tibetan government in exile, we'll be very happy to welcome it. But as Indreshji also spoke about the multiplicity of issues that confronts India, we do not want to become an aberrance, in the process. But we do. I want to assure you that we do have very good relationship with the Indian government, a very open relationship, very transparent relationship. But if, as the attendees of this conference believe that Tibet should gain independence, then it cannot. The support cannot come only from the public. There has to be a government intention or intervention to give us the encouragement that this is also possible. Right now, it's difficult to get that sense. And when I'm asked about Indian government's position on Tibet, His Holiness used to say the Indian government is very overcautious when it comes to China. Now I tell other people, maybe it's time to remove the over, but Indian government still is cautious from the developments that we are hearing today also. So if there has to be affirmative thinking from the CTA also, then there has to be affirmative support from governments that matter. That's also important. So now, with these two books, we inform the international community that if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, then we tell them you are going against international law. Because the only one agreement that we have with Communist China is 17-point agreement, which was forced upon us in May 1951. And that is post-invasion of China, of Chamdo in October 1950. So under international law, any agreement post-aggression is not valid. It's null and void. So if international law has to be applied, it has to be applied to every country, every people. Tibet cannot be an exception to this just because Tibet is under China's occupation. So we also tell the international community, on the one hand, you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC at the behest of the Chinese government, which incidentally, the Indian government decided not to reiterate its statement since 2014. There has been some change. 2010? 2010 onwards. So the Indian government has not repeated that statement. Even as close as post to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the Chinese government asked every embassy of its in other countries to seek reconfirmation of the One China policy, and even at that time, Indian government said that we do not reiterate what we have already stated before. So these are subtle messages that are being sent to China. Whereas when countries keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC at the behest of the Chinese government, and then on the other hand, maybe to appease His Holiness, keeps repeating the statement that they support negotiation between the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. We tell the international community these two don't go together. Because Chinese government rules Tibet with an iron hand. We are talking about George Orwell's book 1984, which has now turned into reality inside China, where every single thing is monitored by the government. Every movement of the people are monitored by the government. And I was thinking this morning, last night, when we arrived around 9 o'clock at night, I received 2-3 communications saying there are a lot of large-scale protests going on in China. And then BBC was the first to cover on international news last night. And this morning, it was being taken up by Indian media also. And this time, what is happening in China, the protests that seem to be sporadic in different places, coming from Shanghai to Beijing to Nanjing to Chongqing and Urumqi. In fact, it was said that it was fueled by an event in Urumqi where a building was burning, and because of zero COVID policy, people were locked inside and they couldn't come out of the house. So that triggered the protests inside China, and many believe that this is happening in many campuses around China. So these are very new, just recent, just yesterday, as we speak, it's going on in the last few days. And it's very important to watch these developments, because I've always said that if there could be anything that destabilizes China, it could be implosion within China. Of course, economy is very bad. But then, let me come back to how our narrative, how we explain to the international community about the historical angle, that China rules inside Tibet with an iron hand, and the whole international community keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC. Then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? हमारे पास आने का क्या वजह रहा चीन को? Because there's no reason for them to come to talk to us, because they rule Tibet with an iron hand, and the whole international community keeps saying Tibet is part of PRC, more like saying we give you a blank check to do whatever you want in Tibet and we won't say anything. Right? But we tell the international community, we lived on the Tibetan plateau for many centuries by ourselves, isolated from the world, thinking that Himalayas and all the mountain ranges that surrounds us will protect us. And without our knowledge, others have been deciding for us, whether it's British India or China or Russia or whoever. Now when we are in exile, every other country is deciding for us that Tibet is part of PRC. Now tell me, how many people have read Tibetan history to claim that? कितने लोगों ने पढ़ा है तिब्बती इतिहास को? Not many people know. But for their own economic benefit, they say things which Chinese government want them to say. Now the question is, there are so many countries in this world where one country has invaded another country. Do you find any other instance in this world where this country who invaded the other country keeps claiming or tells other countries to say that this is part of us? हमने तो नहीं सुना. Look at China itself. Are the Chinese saying that the other countries should say that Manchuria is part of China, or Mongolia is part of China, or East Turkestan is part of China? No. Why it is happening only with Tibet? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy to rule Tibet. And the international community has no right to grant any legitimacy for China to rule Tibet. If it has to be resolved, then that legitimacy can be given only by His Holiness Dalai Lama or the Tibetan people after reaching a solution. So that is what we try to tell the international community, that this is what it is, with a multiple impact of sending a message to the Chinese government, as well as tell the international community that this is not the right thing. That is why we made some efforts, even though Indreshji says that situation cannot be compared between United States and India. Of course, India has to face much more different situation than United States, but United States having given this support itself is very important for us. So this April, we approached the US Congress. We came out with several suggestions for action in the Congress. And what happened in June, one was that we managed to, our friends in the Congress managed to organize a expert's testimony on the historical status of Tibet. Now it is on the record of the US Congress that Tibet was an independent country. And on the other hand, Based on similar line, we also, the Congress has also moved a bill in the House in countering China's false narrative on Tibetan history and recognizing Tibet as an unresolved conflict. On these two issues, it's still being worked on. Now, if the new Congress comes in, the new House comes in, we may have to introduce in the bill again in the House, and then in the Senate. It might take some time, but these are some of the progress that we have made towards seeking recognition of the historical status of Tibet, which is important. Otherwise, not many people know that His Holiness had climbed down from independence to middle way to find a mutually beneficial, negotiated solution, because I always tell my people that we have to understand these two premises. One is that if the Tibetan issue has to be, the Sino-Tibet conflict needs to be resolved in a non-violent way. If China breaks up, that's a different matter. But otherwise, we will have to talk with the Chinese government. There's no other way. We can't expect India to send its army to fight against the Chinese for the Tibetans. No. And the other reality also, just to make sure that we are not disappointed in the future when things are not achieved, we have to be, our expectations also needs to be realistic. We don't expect Indian government to leave aside their national interests and put Tibet's national interests first. No. If this cannot happen with the government of India, it cannot happen with any other governments in the world. So this reality also we have to understand. So based on these two realities, then we have to set up our expectations and see how we can maneuver situations. So lately, of course, it has only been about 1.5 months that I took over the Sikyong of Central Tibetan Administration, and we also traveled around the world to several countries. And the perception that, the feeling that we are getting is that, of course, US and Canada has been strong supporters for a long time. Even though Canada doesn't have an act, it behaves in a manner similar to US government. And with the government of India, as I mentioned before also, we have very good understanding and support and very transparent relationship. And things in Europe are changing. At the level of perception is changing. There is a realization that the immediate problem is Russia, but the long-term challenge is definitely China. But now we have to see how that perception transforms into policy and program level. So this is something, it's a good time for us to speak about Tibet or East Turkestan or Inner Mongolians or Hong Kongers. In Europe, some of them are just waking up. It's a very complicated system with 27 countries, and everybody is developing their own China strategy. Maybe we'll look for a time when Europeans are more united in their approach, in their foreign policy approach, particularly Indochina or China. That's why we keep telling the Europeans, don't look at us only from the perspective of a victim of communist China. If you can start looking at us as partners, and if you want to bring about positive changes in China eventually, you need both internal and external forces. And Tibetans are the internal forces. East Turkestanis are the internal forces. Mongolians are the internal forces. So also the Hong Kongers and Taiwanese. So if we all can work together from that perspective, not looking only from the perspective of a victim, but as a partner to bring about changes in China, then there could be better cooperation and equal cooperation. We also tell the Europeans, it's Americans, it is Europeans, it is Japanese, it's Taiwanese, all these countries who invested so much money in China created this monster called China today. So now you can't expect America alone to contain China. China has become too big for that. So there has to be transatlantic cooperation, working along with other liberal democracies in the world if you have to really contain China and bring changes, positive changes in China. So this is just our approach to the international community. We have been to Japan also. We are seeing a lot of new developments, international developments. As we speak also, things are changing. It's very dynamic, very fluid. Every single day we have to watch. But something that we need to watch out over the last few days that has been happening in China in the last few days are going to be very, very consequential. So this situation needs to be watched, and we also have to see how and what we can do as Tibet support groups or Tibetans from outside China. If you look at the movements that are happening in Iran, your support from the international community is also important. Expressions of support for these movements are also important if it emanates from different parts of the world. So that'll be useful. So I really appreciate all the initiatives that Indreshji mentioned about, Sujitji mentioned about, particularly with the All-Party Indian Parliamentary Forum for Tibet. I myself was personally involved in rejuvenating that in 2002 when I was the director of Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center. And then again, there has always been ups and downs in the formations of these groups and also the functions of these groups depending on the leadership and participation of the members. It's not like here you are all represented from east to west, from north to south, from all parts of India, and there are so many others who are not represented here. So similarly in the parliament also there is a lot of sympathy for the cause of Tibet, but those needs to be turned into concrete action. I think even though there are many members of parliament who are acquainted with foreign policy issues, particularly with in relation to China, there are many others who also don't know about the situation there. So it's very important that we spread awareness on that. And also just to inform you about the situation in exile and some of the challenges that we face. We did a survey. Now this cabinet is very focused and very determined to focus on numbers and developing structures and systems. So whoever comes after me as Sikyong should not be a problem with structures and systems. So because of which we collected a number, and because of the image and the personality of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, people believe that there must be many Tibetans in all around the world. It's not so. The exile community is only about 130,000 Tibetans in exile. And as per our latest survey, in India it's only about 68,500 now. It has come down a lot. And then Tibetans in Bhutan is about 1,500, Tibetans in Nepal a little more than 10,000. So that's only about 80,000 Tibetans out of 130,000, and 50,000 Tibetans are spread across more than 25 different countries in the West. So we see wherever there are challenges, there are opportunities. So one of the challenges that we face is the dispersing community. Many young Tibetans who can give birth to babies, who can give productive labor, they are moving out to Indian cities and towns and also to other foreign countries in the West because there are not enough suitable opportunities, job opportunities for the Tibetans in the rural areas where the settlements are located. So it is incumbent upon us to make sure that this is also the opportunity for us to build back our compact communities. The reason why we are focusing so much on the compact communities is because in the last 63 years, because of the help of the Indian government, both at the central and state level, and with the foresightedness of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Tibetan compact communities were established in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and because of which we started schools separately for Tibetans by the Indian government and also on our own. Not all the schools are operated by the Indian government. We have quite a number of schools that are run autonomously. So in all this, the population is coming down. The number of children is going down. This is our second challenge. So from 2012, where we had a little more than 20,000 Tibetan children, in 2021, in 9 years, it has come down to 9,700 children. We are talking about more than 1,000 children on average declining every single year. The reasons that are attributable to these consequences are because, one, less number of children coming from Tibet. So before 2008, we used to receive any number between 2,500 to 3,000 Tibetans every year from inside Tibet, most of them children, sent here to study, not knowing whether they will ever meet their families again or not. Now, in 2020, we had only 5 Tibetans from Tibet. In 2021, only 10 Tibetans. In 2022, only 4 so far from inside Tibet. This is also one of the reasons why the number of students are declining over the years. And the other reason is out-migration from India and Nepal to other countries in the West. And when the parents go, children also go with them. And the third is common to everybody in the world, where you have very low birth rate. So this is the situation right now of 130,000 Tibetans, out of which 80,000 in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, about 50,000 in the rest of the world, except inside Tibet. So we are talking about 60-40% change. So these two, because of these two issues, now we have to think long-term. For the Tibetan, as His Holiness always says, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Now, hope for the best, of course, we'll be looking at every possible avenue to resolve this Sino-Tibet conflict. But at the same time, if we have to survive for another 30-40 years, then we have to build our community. And that is one of the main focus of this cabinet, to build back compact communities. So we found that there are more than 2,000 Tibetans, families, or more than 5,000 individuals who have come from Tibet in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s who doesn't have a single inch of land because they are not provided with anything. The Indian government provided for those who came in the 60s and 70s, 60s, not after that. So these people also need to be cared for. And that also involves a lot of money to relocate these people. And I was just, before we started this meeting, I was discussing with Honorable Sujit Kumar ji, because we have a big settlement in, one settlement in Odisha. Of course, you mentioned about Biju Patnaik ji. I read about him also. The Indian government started giving importance to Tibetan army only after the 1962 war. So an office was established here in Saket in Delhi in 1964. And the Charbadia airport in Orissa was commissioned by Nehru, Pandit Nehru ji, to Biju Patnaik to turn that private airfield into a supply ground for Tibetan, for the establishment number 22, which is a special frontier force. So Biju ji had played a very important, that's why I was thinking, how come we have one settlement in Orissa? So that must have been the connection, because Biju Patnaik ji was an adventurist. He was not only a pilot, but I think he cycled from Delhi to Mumbai those days. So he was quite an active politician, not just a chief minister. He also wanted to start a, I think, commercial flight from India to Lhasa if things had not changed in Tibet with the Kalinga Airlines. So those developments have been there, and Orissa also we are looking at one of the destinations to move people to develop as a green village for the new people who will be moved there, so that we can strengthen these. We have to think about long-term integrated programs for the Tibetans to be able to come back to the settlements and be employed there. So there are many other programs that we are talking about, but these are some of the challenges I think that you also need to understand. And we also go with a begging ball to the international community. Only 9% of our expenses are met by the Tibetans. The rest, 91%, we also go with a begging ball. So just to give you an idea of how we function and how much support would be necessary into the future, because these supports are very crucial. And then, of course, one issue that really concerns India is the environmental issue that is going on. This time, we were received in Arunachal, not only this time, my predecessor was also honored with the state guest status, both in, this time, both in Arunachal Pradesh and Meghalaya. We were accorded the same status, and when we were going from Meo to Pasighat and Pasighat to Tuting, because that helicopter route falls on the Brahmaputra. So when you can see from the helicopter, the river that is coming from Tibet, the Sikyong River in Assam, in Arunachal Pradesh, is very dirty. It's like tea. It's very muddy. And all the tributaries that are joining the river are clear blue water. And this is not rainy season in Tibet. So it's not because of soil erosion that resulted because of rainwater. And this is happening because of activities inside China, inside Tibet, where China is supposed to be building this dam on the Brahmaputra, which is twice the size of Three Gorges. And if something happens to the size of that kind of a dam, then what will happen to Assam? Many will perish. So these are issues that you need not shy away from speaking about. Because China does not share hydrological data with anybody else. We call ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. In our prayers also, just like Indreshji asks us to pray every evening, we always keep saying, Khangri Rave Ko Shingham Jong, the heavenly abode, surrounded by snow mountain ranges. That is what we called ourselves. And that is the topography of Tibet. That is the geography of Tibet. And then Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world. I saw it in one of the books published in 1906. And then Asians called Tibet the water tower of Asia. Now Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole, because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers that go into all the South Asian and Southeast Asian countries, from Pakistan to Nepal, India, Bangladesh, to Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and into China. Two of the main rivers in China, which are the lifelines of China, one is the cradle of civilization of China, originate from Tibet. And for the first time, a few months back, we heard that Mekong's height has come down by 50%, and it is no more navigable by ship. And it has affected hydroelectricity production in the region. So these are some of the things Chinese themselves can see for themselves, by themselves. In fact, one of the reasons why Chinese started giving little importance to Tibet's environment was way back in 1998, when there was a huge flood on the Yangtze, where many properties were destroyed and many lives were also destroyed. Since then, they started giving little importance to Tibet's environment. But it's not enough. There is not an international environmental scientist studying along with Chinese environmental scientists about what is happening inside Tibet. So there's no report. There are a lot of climate changes are going on, climate change conferences are going on, but nobody is talking about Tibet. Everybody is so afraid of China. That's why I tell the Western countries, aapko gada banna hai to ban lo. Chinese will keep riding you. If you don't stand up to your values, Chinese will never ever respect you. Now India is being respected because of the position that the Indian government has taken on Ladakh or Doklam that Indreshji covered. Now, of course, Indian government is very firm that till all the armies are taken back, there will not be any normalization of relationships. Just this morning also there was news about Chinese government holding conferences with so many other countries where India was not part of it. So all these developments are there. Many people believe that China is very strong. Of course, they may be strong militarily, politically, economically, but those are also, some of them are also chinks in the armor. China is the only country, let's say, in the Politburo, now they call it 1+6. Earlier it is 7 Politburo members. Now Xi Jinping will become the authoritarian ruler, where all the 6 will have to kowtow to him and listen to what he says. So he'll become a dictator, right? 1+6. China is the only country, here also I want to mention this fact that Chinese Politburo, not more than 3 members of the Politburo members can meet together without the express permission of the president. What does that imply? That implies a lot of, they are afraid of internal coup. And then Xi Jinping also made sure that generals are transferred every year. They are not allowed to sit in one place to build better relations with the cadres. That also rules out military coup to a certain extent. And China is the only country that spends more money on internal security than external security. That itself manifests deep distrust between the rulers and the ruled. So this, when on 16th October, when Xi Jinping reiterated his policy on Taiwan and also reiterated the zero COVID policy, I said in Europe, Xi Jinping is digging his own grave. And now, if you see the developments of protests, it's happening. And I've also told the international community, even to our Chinese friends many times when they talk about the life of His Holiness, I tell them, let us see whether His Holiness the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party or the Communist Party outlives the Dalai Lama. So, to conclude, I want to say that His Holiness has been very exuberant and very high spirit to live for another 15, 20 years. Another 2 decades, even up to 110, 113, he has been assuring us, and it is on the part of the Lama that he decided to live long for the benefit of all the sentient beings and also the Tibetans in particular. But then it's incumbent, when I speak to the Tibetan population, I tell them it is up to the Tibetan population to see whether His Holiness lives that long, because then we talk about the Guru-Shishya relationship, where the Shishya has to understand the thinkings of the Lama and perform accordingly. So it's good that you Indians want Tibet to be independent. We have no objection to that. But then ultimately, Tibet's issue has to be decided by the Tibetans depending on the reality of the situation. So whatever comes out, but right now, we are following the middle way approach. We'll stick with that approach and we'll see how best to move forward with the new techniques and the tactics that we have adopted and see what kind of repercussions are drawn from there. And if that doesn't work, then there may be other ways out in future. But as of now, as all our Indian friends keep saying, Azadi, Azadi, there is no Tibetan who doesn't want independence. But the question is, how do we achieve that? So how much support will there be from Government of India? How much support will there be from the international community for Tibetan independence? Because as was mentioned, even Buddhist countries are hesitant to support Tibetan. It's not because they don't want to support, but because they're afraid of China. They are too dependent on China. That is the only reason why it's happening. So if there are more chorus of demands for those things, then there could be change, who knows? It will depend, for us to have encouragement also will depend a lot on how countries react. We cannot act or decide on ourselves, but it is incumbent upon us to tell the world about Tibet's history, status in Tibet, and how we look at resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict. So you as Tibet supporters, it's very important that you raise the voice. I will be very happy if you organize events in colleges and universities to spread more awareness. If there are opportunities, I would also like to come and speak to the younger generations of Tibetans, not only the Tibetans, but also the Indian population. Sometimes we wonder, we live here in India, but how many Indians know about Tibet? That's also a question. So we'll have to, with all your efforts, we have Tibetans, some 4,000 families are dependent on sweater selling for their livelihood. So you are coming from different states of India, and we do have sometimes problems with marketplaces and things like that. We will be appointing 2 people in India-Tibet Coordination Office to help out with these issues, which are quite a big problem for the Tibetans, because this is one of the main supplementary income for the Tibetans, other than agriculture, which is just 1 acre dry land. So it's any help in those sectors would also be very, very highly appreciated. And with the Himalayan region, I've always said our relation, of course, even though we are different countries, we share the same culture and the same religion. And as of today, in the 288 registered monasteries and nunneries under the Religion and Culture Department of the Central Tibetan Administration, there are about 42,000 monks and nuns, out of which 66% are from the Himalayan region, whether it's Indians or Nepalese or Bhutanese. So even though we are refugees, we are forced, people who are forced out of our country to move to another world, I want to tell you that we cooperate with the host nation also to provide education for that many number of monks and nuns. Everything provided for by the Tibetans, and another 6,000, let us say, local Indians and Himalayan students in Tibetan schools. So that would account to about 34,000 Indians, Nepalese, and Bhutanese that Tibetans are taking care of. So we receive help from the Indian government, but we also reciprocate back by helping people from the, so it is a cooperation that needs, I think, long-term thinking. So now that 66% are from Himalayan region, mostly small children, we cannot decide for the Himalayan children. So for their future, we have talked with Jamyang Tsering Namgyal also to promote his idea of these children getting some equivalent certificate from the monastic orders that they are studying in, being part of a feeder school of the Ladakh Buddhist University. So those things are also happening. Just wanted to tell you for your information that this is the structure within which we function. And of course, there are so many limitations, including finance, but we have to work towards achieving all of that. In the meantime, it's my job to keep the community together. Last 63 years, His Holiness has been going around the world with his folded hands, and that is the reason why, even though we are very small in number, the Tibetan issue is very much alive. Now we need your support more than ever before. Now that His Holiness is aging and he will not be traveling much, now we need your support more than ever before. And now it's also incumbent upon the 130,000 Tibetans to see whether we can reach the goals set by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I will do everything possible within my human capability to take the issue forward, to work on it as much as possible, and to make sure that it reaches a logical conclusion. So thank you very much for your presence, and thank you for the honor.